Hello, my name's David Robertson, and this is another one of the educational videos from the Hammer and Tongs, brought to you by artistblacksmith.com. Today I'm going to teach you how to make a rosette. I'll include the outer diameter of the rosette and the button in the center, and I'll talk about the tendril that it's assembled to. Let's get started. So to start, I use two pieces of steel. One's a 1/4 inch thick and 2 inches square, 2 by 2, and the other is 3/4 round and about 6 inches long. Now, I only use part of the 3/4 inch round. You'll see that it's being cut off. So here I start with the square piece, and I'm nipping the corners off to create an octagonal. So this is just done with the hot cut. And I rotate through all 4 corners. I'm using a fairly heavy hammer here, and the hot cut you can see is quite a slim one. And get the last corner, and then I'll break the corners off. When you're hot cutting, you never want to cut all the way through. And then the bits are just tossed into my scrap bucket, which is out of the frame of the video. Previous to doing any work on this square piece of steel, I have center punched it. It's hard to see in the video in the lighting, but it does give me a center mark so that I can track to when I'm doing the work. After I've nipped the corners off, I come in on the edge and I'm hammering down to essentially create a round piece of steel that's 1/4 inch thick, and I flatten out as I go. So obviously you could start with a 1/4 inch cut off piece of mild steel that was 2 inches round in diameter. And again, because of the organic nature of the rosette, I'm not worried that it's not perfectly round. It just goes into the character of the flower. So a few more hammer strokes and I'll get the desired shape that I'm after. I'm using a guided but sloppy blow with a hammer, and this is mostly to keep the steel from folding over on itself. So I'm trying to actually impart the force just to the outer surface of the steel as opposed to deep into the steel. And you can see as I'm working away I have to straighten things out, but I am getting a mostly circular disc. So as I work the edges, it will thicken up a little bit, but that's fine for my application. And around and around. That's pretty close to the circle that I need. Back to the forge. Now I'm using a hold down to clamp the piece, and I'm starting with a hand chisel to create radial lines out from the center. I start with 4 very deep ones, and in a moment you'll see I switch over to the air hammer. You could use the air hammer, you could use a treadle hammer, you could put them in by hand. Whatever equipment you have available is fine. But what I start with is 4, making a cross or a plus sign on the surface of the rosette. Should be able to see a little bit of it here. And then I'll do the same on the other side. And you see I've switched over to the air hammer here, using a small chisel. Because of the added thickness in the steel, I can cut fairly deep. Of course, you want to be careful not to cut all the way through, because it will destroy your piece. Later on, I'll go back in by hand and create shallow radial lines in between the ones that we've done here. So these are 4 cross lines, and then I would do 8 cross lines, and that separates the individual petals of the rosette. Just adds a little bit more distinction. But here you can see I'm working with the air hammer. And I'm really just trying to tap it with the air hammer. There's certainly a lot of extra force that I could work with, but that's not the application in this project. It's really to be quite delicate with it. There you can see the cross or the plus sign. And again, I'm using that center point as my marker. That's what I'm tracking from each time. So now I'll start using the cross peen of the hammer, and what I'm trying to do is texture between those marks that I put on and not distort the marks that I've already cut into it. And what's going to happen is that the steel is going to stretch out towards the edge of the rosette where I'm hammering it with a cross peen, but it's going to close up or pile up quite close to where the cuts are, especially on the edges, and it adds a more dramatic effect to it. Now I am working fairly hot with this. In the video it shows that it's almost a white heat, but it's actually out of yellow and down into the oranges. Now when I get the texture developed on all 4, then I've gone back in, you haven't seen this in the video, but I've done that radial line to create it 8 petals instead of the 4 petals. And now I'm working in between on the 8s. You can see a little bit of the line pattern on the rosette here. Now the hammer I'm using, the cross peen's quite blunt. There, you can see the pattern quite nicely. And this spreads the metal more than cuts into it. And again, depending on your personal preference, you may work with a sharper cross peen or more of a blunt cross peen. I like really sculpting the steel, getting a very dramatic form to it, as opposed to just denting it or cutting into it. And I work all 8 until I'm satisfied with what I've got. And you can see I'm working right at the edge of the anvil because I'm really thinning that edge out, so it's only about a 1/16 of an inch thick. So I'm now going to punch the center of the rosette with a square punch, because the button that goes in the center is actually a square stemmed rivet. So just simple punching. Couple taps until I feel the resistance of the top of the anvil, and then I use my backing plate that has a square hole in it, and I just drive through again until I feel it snug up on the anvil. A few taps to release it. And there's essentially the finished rosette. And now I'll switch over to that 3/4 round bar. Now I'm really only using about the last inch of material on this, but the 6 inches gives me enough that I can hang on to with the tongs. So the first thing is I shoulder it, and I work the shoulder down. It's a fairly small stem that I'm looking for. And then I'll draw that stem out. Which you should see next. So just on the edge of the anvil. Now I have a lot of extra material in that stem, so I end up cutting off about 1 inch of material once I get it drawn out. So I work all 4 sides, try and keep the stem in the center of the bar. Now I'm cutting off. Now I'm going to work again all 4 sides with the cutting off, so that I've got that a central cone, if you will, on the top of what's going to become the button or the rivet. If I just cut through from one side, I'll actually have a little bit more thickness in the metal on one side than the other. Again, cutting all the way around, all sides evenly. And breaking off the beginning of the rivet. Now this could be riveted to the back of the rosette, or you could weld it. It depends again on your application if you're doing traditional joinery. This backing plate has a smaller hole in it, and I use it for upsetting the rivet, but you notice the circles on it? That gives me essentially a target pattern for upsetting the head into, and I found this works very well for me. And these are just drawn on with a pencil crayon or chalk. They do rub off, and I just draw them on again for the next time. And it allows me to see exactly which side of the rivet I need to pull the steel over to get an even top. I'll go back in for another heat. And then this one, I just hammer down until it finally meets the round surface. This way I can keep my stem in the center of the disc. Often I have had problems with the stem in the center, and this I found was a good way of alleviating that problem. Now I'm creating some texture on the button, and this is just with a center punch. You could use virtually any punch or chisel that you wanted to create the texture. And this is just sort of a random pattern. And then I'm essentially right now just filling in the spots that I missed. And because it's a center punch, I can work it virtually cold and still have not a problem with creating the texture. In the next clip you'll see a little bit more of the texture. So those are the two pieces. The button with the center square shaft and square hole that it fits into, and the rosette. Now I'll show you a couple pictures, close-ups of what it looks like when it's finished. So they're just straight out of the forge. I haven't wire wheeled it or anything. The two component pieces. This one assembled face on, and then this one to the side. It'll show you a little bit of the degree of texture. Thank you for watching, and for more information on blacksmithing, please see artistblacksmith.com.